On a gray November morning in 1982, Catherine Walsh unlocked the heavy oak doors of the Boston Public Library's main branch on Boylston Street, breathing in the familiar scent of aging paper and furniture polish, unaware that the routine task of processing overdue book notices would expose one of the most sophisticated Soviet intelligence operations ever conducted on American soil. For 7 years, she had served as the head librarian of the research department, a position that granted her intimate knowledge of who borrowed what, when they borrowed it, and most tellingly, what patterns emerged from those borrowing habits. She believed her work involved nothing more significant than helping scholars access information and gently reminding forgetful patrons to return their materials on time. What she was about to discover would prove that even the most mundane records, the checkout cards and due date stamps that libraries had been using for generations, could become windows into hidden worlds where nothing was quite as it seemed. But before we dive into this story, make sure to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so we can bring you the most gripping Cold War and espionage stories every day. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support us. Catherine Walsh was 44 years old that autumn, a woman whose entire adult life had been devoted to the quiet service of connecting people with knowledge. She had grown up in Cambridge, the daughter of a philosophy professor at Harvard, and a schoolteacher mother who had instilled in her a reverence for books and learning. After graduating from Simmons College with a degree in library science, she had worked her way up through various positions in the Boston library system, eventually earning the prestigious role of research department head at the main branch. The position suited her perfectly. She loved the intellectual challenge of helping researchers navigate the library's vast collections, loved the detective work involved in tracking down obscure references and forgotten sources, and loved the sense of order that came from maintaining comprehensive records of what materials moved through her department. The research department occupied the 3rd floor of the library, a grand space with high ceilings, tall windows that let in soft northern light, and row upon row of dark wooden shelves holding specialized collections. The department served a specific clientele: serious researchers working on academic projects, graduate students writing dissertations, independent scholars pursuing particular obsessions, and the occasional journalist or writer seeking primary sources for their work. Unlike the general circulation areas downstairs, where popular novels and bestsellers changed hands constantly, the research department dealt with materials that were rarely borrowed, books and documents that might sit untouched for years before someone finally requested them. This made Catherine's record-keeping even more meticulous. Every borrowed item was logged with the borrower's name, library card number, date of checkout, and expected return date. The system was old-fashioned, still relying on paper cards and manual filing, but Catherine preferred it that way. The physical act of handling the cards, filing them by hand, reviewing them regularly, gave her a tactile connection to the collection that computer systems could never replicate. On this particular November morning, Catherine was conducting one of her routine audits, a quarterly review of overdue materials that helped identify patterns and problems in the collection. She sat at her desk with a stack of checkout cards spread before her, cross-referencing them against the library's master catalog to determine which items needed to be recalled. The work was tedious but meditative, requiring careful attention while allowing her mind to drift into that pleasant state librarians know well, half focused on the task at hand, half wandering through associations and connections that emerge from immersion in information. She was about halfway through the stack when something caught her attention, a pattern so subtle that most people would have missed it entirely. But Catherine had spent decades developing an instinct for anomalies in borrowing behavior. A single patron had checked out 17 different books over the past 8 months, all from the research department's specialized collections. On its own, this was not unusual. Serious researchers often borrowed multiple volumes over extended periods. What struck Catherine as odd was the combination of subjects these particular books covered. 3 volumes dealt with American nuclear weapons development programs, specifically the history of the Manhattan Project and subsequent hydrogen bomb research. 4 books focused on submarine warfare and naval intelligence gathering methods. 2 were technical manuals about satellite communication systems. 3 covered cryptography and code-breaking techniques. The remaining 5 dealt with various aspects of Soviet-American relations during the Cold War, but with particular emphasis on intelligence operations and espionage cases. Catherine sat back in her chair and stared at the checkout cards spread across her desk. Each card by itself told an innocent story. A researcher interested in military history might reasonably borrow books about nuclear weapons or submarine warfare. Someone writing about Cold War diplomacy would naturally consult materials on intelligence operations. But taken together, viewed as a pattern rather than isolated incidents, these 17 books suggested something more specific and more troubling. This was not the eclectic borrowing pattern of a graduate student casting a wide net for dissertation research. This was not the broad curiosity of a casual history enthusiast exploring various topics. This was focused intelligence gathering, systematic research into specific technical and strategic subjects that someone would need to understand if they were, for instance, attempting to brief foreign handlers on American military capabilities and vulnerabilities. Catherine pulled the library card application from her files, finding the patron's information easily. The borrower's name was listed as Dr. Michael Preston. His address was in Brookline, an affluent suburb adjacent to Boston. His occupation was listed as independent researcher and consultant. He had opened his library account 14 months earlier, providing all the necessary documentation and references. Nothing about the application appeared suspicious. The signature was clear and professional. The local address could be easily verified. The occupation, while vague, was not uncommon among the library's research patrons. Many consultants and freelance writers maintained similar credentials. But Catherine's instincts, honed by decades of working with researchers and understanding how genuine scholars operated, told her something was wrong with this pattern. She spread the 17 checkout cards in chronological order, studying the progression of subjects. Dr. Preston had started his borrowing with relatively innocuous materials, general histories of World War II and the early Cold War period. Then, gradually, his selections had become more technical and more focused. The books about nuclear weapons had been borrowed in sequence, each one more detailed than the last. The submarine warfare materials had followed a similar progression, moving from general overviews to highly technical discussions of sonar systems and underwater detection methods. Most tellingly, the cryptography books he had borrowed were not popular histories of code breaking, but rather dense technical volumes that assumed significant mathematical knowledge and would be of interest primarily to someone actually trying to understand how modern encryption systems worked. Catherine thought about the genuine researchers she had helped over the years, the scholars who became her regular patrons and whose projects she came to know intimately through their borrowing patterns. Real researchers rarely moved in such straight lines. They followed tangents and pursued digressions. They borrowed books that turned out to be irrelevant to their projects. They returned materials early because they realized a particular source did not contain what they needed. They asked questions, sought recommendations, engaged in conversations about their work. Dr. Michael Preston had done none of these things. He had borrowed exactly 17 books over 8 months, each one directly relevant to understanding American military and intelligence capabilities, each one returned precisely on its due date, and he had never once asked Catherine or any of her staff for assistance in locating additional materials. That absence of normal research behavior was perhaps the most telling detail of all. Catherine pulled out her calendar and noted the dates when Dr. Preston had visited the library. He came every 3 to 4 weeks, always on a Wednesday afternoon, always between 2 and 4 o'clock. The regularity suggested a pattern, the kind of scheduled routine that someone might establish to facilitate regular reporting to a handler or to maintain a predictable cover activity. Real researchers, in Catherine's experience, came to libraries when their schedules permitted or when pressing research needs demanded it. They did not maintain such rigid timing unless they were treating the library visit as an appointment rather than a research session. She considered her options carefully. She could simply ignore what she had noticed, tell herself she was reading too much into innocent borrowing patterns, and return to her routine work. Many people would have made that choice, unwilling to invite scrutiny or skepticism by reporting suspicions based on nothing more than library checkout cards. But Catherine had grown up in a household where civic responsibility was taken seriously, where her professor father had emphasized that citizenship required active engagement rather than passive acceptance. She had also read enough history, had processed enough materials about the Cold War and espionage to understand that Soviet intelligence operations were sophisticated and ongoing, that the KGB had invested enormous resources in placing agents throughout American society, and that these agents often hid behind the most respectable covers, academic credentials, professional positions, ordinary suburban addresses that deflected suspicion. Catherine picked up her phone and dialed the number for the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Boston field office. She had never contacted the FBI before, had never imagined she would have reason to, but she knew the number from the emergency contact list posted in the library's administrative offices. The receptionist who answered transferred her call after Catherine explained that she had information about possible foreign intelligence activity. There was a brief wait, then a male voice came on the line, identifying himself as Special Agent Thomas Riley. Catherine took a deep breath and began explaining what she had discovered. She described the borrowing pattern, the progression of subjects, the technical nature of the materials, and the suspicious regularity of Dr. Preston's visits. As she spoke, she heard Agent Riley taking notes, the scratch of pen on paper coming clearly through the phone line. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before Riley responded. "Mrs. Walsh," he said, his voice careful and professional. "What you're describing is certainly unusual, but I need to be honest with you. Library borrowing patterns, even suspicious ones, are not typically considered evidence of espionage. There could be dozens of innocent explanations for what you've observed. Dr. Preston might be writing a book about Cold War military technology. He might be consulting for a defense contractor and conducting background research. He might simply be a military history enthusiast with eclectic interests." Catherine had expected this response, had prepared herself for skepticism. "I understand that, Agent Riley. I've been working with researchers for 23 years. I know what normal research patterns look like, and this is not one of them. The books Dr. Preston has borrowed are too focused, too technical, too specifically relevant to current American defense capabilities. A legitimate historian or consultant would be asking questions, seeking guidance, borrowing materials that turned out to be tangential or irrelevant. Dr. Preston has borrowed exactly what someone would need if they were trying to compile an intelligence briefing on American military technology." Riley was quiet for another moment. "Would you be willing to come to our office and provide a more detailed statement? I'd like to have one of our counterintelligence specialists review this information." 2 days later, Catherine sat in a conference room at the FBI's Boston field office, a nondescript building in Government Center. Agent Riley was there, along with a woman who introduced herself as Special Agent Diana Kowalski, a counterintelligence specialist who had spent 15 years tracking Soviet intelligence operations in the northeastern United States. Kowalski was in her early 40s, with sharp eyes and an intensity that reminded Catherine of the most focused graduate students she had worked with, people who pursued their research with single-minded determination. Catherine walked them through everything again, this time with more detail. She had brought copies of all 17 checkout cards, organized chronologically, along with brief descriptions of each book's content that she had prepared from memory and catalog records. As she presented this information, she saw Kowalski's expression change from polite interest to focused attention. The agent began asking specific questions about the timing of borrowings, the sequence of subjects, and any interactions Dr. Preston might have had with library staff. "You said he never asked for assistance," Kowalski noted. "In your experience, is that unusual for someone borrowing this type of technical material?" "Extremely unusual," Catherine replied. "The cryptography books in particular are highly specialized. A genuine researcher, even one with significant background knowledge, would typically want to discuss these materials with library staff who might be able to recommend additional resources or point them toward related collections. Dr. Preston simply filled out his call slips, waited for the materials to be retrieved from storage, checked them out, and left. My staff barely interacted with him beyond the standard checkout procedures." Kowalski made notes in a leather-bound notebook. "What about his physical appearance? Can you describe him?" Catherine closed her eyes, summoning the image of the man who had passed through her department so many times. Approximately 50 years old, maybe slightly older. Average height, perhaps 5'10". Thin build, but not notably so. Brown hair going gray at the temples. He wore glasses, wire-rimmed, professional-looking. Always dressed in business casual attire, khaki pants or dark slacks, button-down shirts, occasionally a sport coat, clean-shaven, no distinguishing marks that I noticed. His manner was polite but distant. He spoke English with no detectable accent, American pronunciation, possibly educated in the Northeast based on certain vowel sounds. "Did he ever come to the library with anyone else?" Riley asked. "Not that I ever observed. He always arrived alone and left alone." Kowalski leaned forward. "Mrs. Walsh, I'm going to be direct with you. What you've identified could potentially be significant. The pattern you've described matches what we call intelligence targeting, systematic research into specific technical areas that would be of interest to foreign intelligence services. The regularity of his visits, the focused nature of his borrowing, and the absence of normal research behavior all raise red flags. However, we need to verify that Dr. Michael Preston is actually who he claims to be before we can take this further. Would you be willing to help us with that verification?" Catherine nodded. "What do you need me to do?" "Continue your normal operations," Kowalski said. "If Dr. Preston follows his pattern, he should visit the library again in about 2 weeks on a Wednesday afternoon. When he does, we'd like you to call this number immediately." She handed Catherine a card with a direct phone line. "We'll have agents nearby who can observe him, document his activities, and follow him when he leaves. We need to understand more about who this person really is and what he's doing with the information he's gathering from your library." Over the next 2 weeks, Catherine continued her regular work, but with heightened awareness of every patron who entered the research department. She found herself studying faces, noting borrowing patterns, wondering how many other anomalies might be hiding in her meticulously maintained records. The thought was both exciting and unsettling. For her entire career, She had viewed libraries as neutral spaces dedicated to the free flow of information, places where anyone could access knowledge regardless of their purpose or politics. But now she understood that neutrality could be exploited, that open access could serve purposes far removed from scholarly inquiry, and that the very openness that made libraries essential to democracy also made them vulnerable to those who would undermine it. On the appointed Wednesday, November 17th, at 2:47 in the afternoon, Dr. Michael Preston walked through the research department doors. Catherine felt her pulse quicken as she watched him approach the card catalog, his movements unhurried and methodical. She waited until he had filled out his call slips and submitted them to the circulation desk. Then she excused herself to her office and dialed the number Agent Kowalski had provided. "He's here," Catherine said simply when Kowalski answered. "Research Department, 3rd floor. He's requested 3 books on satellite reconnaissance systems." "Stay exactly where you are," Kowalski replied. "Maintain your normal routine. We have people in position." Catherine returned to the circulation desk and processed Dr. Preston's request, retrieving the materials he had requested from the locked stacks where the most specialized technical volumes were kept. As she checked out the books, she noted that his library card was about to expire. "Dr. Preston," she said, her voice steady despite her nervousness, "I notice your card expires at the end of this month. You'll need to renew it if you plan to continue using our services." Preston looked up at her with eyes that were polite but curiously flat, as if he were performing the role of an interested patron rather than actually being one. "Thank you for letting me know. I'll take care of that at the front desk on my way out." He gathered his books and left the research department, and Catherine watched him descend the marble staircase toward the main circulation area. Through the tall windows of her department, she could see the street below, where a man in a business suit was reading a newspaper at a bus stop, and a woman was walking a dog past the library entrance. Both looked utterly ordinary, and Catherine wondered if they were FBI agents conducting surveillance or simply regular citizens going about their day. Agent Kowalski called Catherine that evening at home. "We followed Dr. Preston from the library to an apartment building in Brookline. The address matches what he provided on his library application, so at least that part of his cover appears legitimate. We're conducting background checks and surveillance. I'll keep you informed as appropriate, but I want to emphasize again that you should continue your normal operations and give no indication that anything has changed." Over the following weeks, Catherine learned fragments of what the FBI was discovering. The apartment in Brookline was indeed rented to a Michael Preston, and neighbors confirmed that a man matching his description lived there and kept quiet, regular hours. He had no close associates in the building, no visitors that anyone noticed, and no obvious employment that required him to leave for work at specific times. The phone number he had provided on his library application was legitimate and connected to his apartment. When agents ran background checks on Michael Preston, they found a paper trail that looked authentic on the surface: a graduate degree in history from a Midwestern university, several years of work as a research consultant for various clients, a clean credit history, and no criminal record. But as the FBI dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. The university where Preston claimed to have earned his doctorate confirmed that a Michael Preston had graduated from their history program. But when agents interviewed former faculty members, none could remember him clearly. The thesis he had supposedly written could not be located in the university archives. The consulting clients he listed as references either could not be reached or did not remember employing anyone by that name. His credit history, while clean, showed a pattern that suggested the account had been established specifically to create a financial paper trail rather than to conduct genuine commerce. Every detail of Michael Preston's identity when examined closely, revealed itself to be a carefully constructed fiction, professional enough to pass casual scrutiny, but shallow enough to collapse under sustained investigation. "What we believe we have," Agent Kowalski explained to Catherine during a briefing in early December, "is what intelligence services call an illegal, a deep-cover operative living under a false identity with no official protection from diplomatic immunity. These agents are among the most valuable assets any intelligence service can deploy because they can operate for years without detection, gathering information and building networks while maintaining apparently normal lives. The Soviets have been placing illegals in the United States since the 1940s, and we estimate there are dozens currently active, though most of them will never be identified." Catherine absorbed this information with a mixture of fascination and concern. "So the books he borrowed, they were actually intelligence gathering?" "Almost certainly," Kowalski confirmed. "The pattern you identified suggests someone systematically educating himself about American military and intelligence capabilities in areas where the Soviet Union has strategic interest. Satellite reconnaissance, submarine warfare, nuclear weapons systems, cryptography. These are exactly the subjects that would help a handler understand American technical capabilities and potentially identify vulnerabilities. Your borrowing records essentially provided us with a map of what information this operative was collecting and transmitting back to Moscow." The FBI's surveillance of Dr. Michael Preston continued through the winter months. Agents documented his routines, his contacts, his movements throughout Boston and surrounding areas. They observed him making regular visits to the library, always maintaining his Wednesday afternoon schedule, always borrowing materials related to American military and intelligence operations. They watched him take long walks through the city, routes that seemed designed to detect surveillance, and that occasionally included brief meetings with other individuals who appeared to be conducting similar counter-surveillance measures. They monitored his apartment and noted that he possessed a shortwave radio capable of receiving encrypted transmissions from overseas stations. But the FBI faced a critical decision about when to move against Preston. Arresting him immediately would prevent him from gathering more intelligence, but it would also foreclose the opportunity to identify his network, his handlers, and the other operatives he might be working with. If they waited too long, he might become suspicious and flee, or he might transmit information that could compromise American security. Agent Kowalski explained this dilemma to Catherine during one of their regular briefings. "We want to know who else he's in contact with, who his handler is, what network he's part of. But we also can't let him continue operating indefinitely. Right now we're documenting everything, building a comprehensive case, and trying to identify all his contacts before we move. Your cooperation has been invaluable in this process, Mrs. Walsh. The borrowing patterns you identified gave us the initial break we needed." In March of 1983, the FBI made its move. Catherine read about it first in the Boston Globe, a front-page story about the arrest of a suspected Soviet spy who had been operating in the Boston area for at least 3 years under the false identity of Michael Preston. The article noted that the suspect had been apprehended while attempting to service a dead drop in a suburban park, where he had been photographed placing a package of documents beneath a loose stone near a hiking trail. Federal agents had seized the documents, which contained detailed summaries of information about American satellite reconnaissance capabilities, along with microfilm copies of technical diagrams that Preston had apparently photographed from books borrowed from the Boston Public Library. The article sent shockwaves through Boston's academic and professional communities. People struggled to comprehend how a Soviet agent had operated undetected for years, living in a respectable neighborhood, visiting public institutions, conducting systematic intelligence gathering while maintaining the perfect cover of an independent researcher. But for Catherine, the revelation confirmed what her instincts had told her months earlier, that the pattern she had noticed in those 17 checkout cards represented something far more significant than academic curiosity. Agent Kowalski visited Catherine at the library a week after Preston's arrest. They sat in Catherine's office, the same space where this entire investigation had begun, with a stack of overdue book notices and a librarian's trained eye for anomalies. "I wanted to thank you personally," Kowalski said. "Without your observation and your willingness to report what you noticed, we might never have identified Preston. He was extremely careful, maintained excellent operational security, and would likely have continued his intelligence gathering for years if you hadn't recognized the pattern in his borrowing." Catherine felt both proud and troubled by this recognition. "I keep thinking about all the other patrons whose records I've seen over the years. How many patterns have I missed? How many other operatives might be using libraries and other public institutions to gather intelligence?" "That's impossible to know," Kowalski replied. "But what I can tell you is that most people, even trained investigators, would never have noticed what you noticed. It required someone with deep knowledge of how researchers actually behave, someone who had spent decades observing genuine scholarly inquiry and could therefore recognize when that behavior was being simulated rather than authentically performed. You saw through Preston's cover because you understood the difference between someone truly interested in learning and someone systematically harvesting information for another purpose." The case against Michael Preston, whose real name was eventually revealed to be Yuri Volkov, a KGB officer who had been inserted into the United States in 1979, eventually went to trial. Catherine was called to testify about the borrowing patterns she had identified and the systematic nature of Preston's research. Defense attorneys attempted to argue that her observations were circumstantial and that borrowing library books, even books about sensitive subjects, was protected by the First Amendment. But prosecutors demonstrated that Volkov had not simply been reading these materials for personal enrichment. He had been photographing pages, copying diagrams, and transmitting detailed summaries to his handlers in Moscow. The library had been his intelligence collection platform, and Catherine's meticulous records had provided the initial evidence that cracked his cover. Volkov was convicted on multiple counts of espionage and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison, though he was eventually exchanged for American agents held by the Soviet Union in one of the periodic prisoner swaps that characterized Cold War intelligence operations. The case became a training example used by the FBI to teach counterintelligence agents about the importance of seemingly mundane details, about how patterns could reveal hidden operations, and about the value of partnerships with observant citizens who understood their domains well enough to recognize anomalies. For Catherine, the experience fundamentally changed how she viewed her profession. She continued serving as head of the research department for another decade, helping thousands of scholars and students access the library's collections. But she never again looked at borrowing records as merely administrative paperwork. She understood now that these records told stories, that patterns emerged from accumulated data, and that sometimes those patterns pointed toward activities that existed in the shadows of ordinary life. She became more attentive to her patrons' behavior, more conscious of anomalies, more willing to trust her instincts when something felt wrong. The Boston Public Library eventually modernized its checkout system, replacing the old paper cards with computerized records that offered more sophisticated tracking but less tactile connection to the materials. Catherine adapted to the new technology, though she sometimes missed the physical act of handling the cards, the ability to spread them across her desk and study them as she had that November morning in 1982. The new systems made it easier to identify patterns through database queries, but they also made it easier to overlook the kinds of subtle anomalies that only became visible through careful human observation. In the years after the Volkov case, Catherine occasionally lectured at library schools and professional conferences about her experience. She talked about the importance of maintaining detailed records, about the value of understanding patron behavior, and about the civic responsibility that came with managing information institutions. She emphasized that librarians were not simply custodians of books, but rather guardians of knowledge systems that could be exploited for purposes far removed from the noble ideals of open access and intellectual freedom. This did not mean libraries should become surveillance states or that patrons' privacy should be violated, but it did mean that librarians had a responsibility to remain aware of their institution's vulnerabilities and to report suspicious patterns when they emerged. The story of how a librarian identified a Soviet spy through borrowed books became something of a legend in intelligence circles, a reminder that espionage was not only conducted by trained operatives using sophisticated technology, but also involved the mundane details of daily life, the checkout cards and library visits, and systematic research that could hide in plain sight. Catherine Walsh's contribution to national security came not from any dramatic action or heroic intervention, but rather from the simple act of paying attention, of noticing patterns, and of trusting her professional judgment enough to report what she had observed. Years later, after the Cold War had ended and the Soviet Union had collapsed, Catherine thought often about Yuri Volkov and the months he had spent visiting her library, borrowing books, conducting his systematic intelligence gathering. She wondered what his life had been like, living under a false identity in a foreign country, maintaining his cover for years, never able to truly connect with the people around him because every interaction was part of his operational security. She wondered if he had ever actually read the books he borrowed, or if they were merely tools to be exploited, sources of information to be extracted and transmitted without any genuine intellectual engagement. She wondered if he had appreciated the irony that his downfall had come not from sophisticated counterintelligence technology or dramatic spy versus spy confrontations, but from a librarian who understood how researchers behaved and recognized when that behavior was being performed rather than lived. The library continued its mission of providing access to information, serving scholars and students and curious citizens who wanted to learn about the world. The research department remained a quiet space dedicated to serious inquiry, where people came to study difficult subjects and wrestle with complex ideas. But everyone who worked there now understood that openness carried risks as well as rewards, that the very qualities that made libraries essential to democratic society, the free flow of information, the absence of censorship, the commitment to serving all patrons equally, also made them vulnerable to those who would exploit that openness for purposes that contradicted democratic values. Catherine Walsh retired from the Boston Public Library in 1995 after 32 years of service. Her colleagues organized a reception in the research department, the space she had guarded and guided for so long. They presented her with a leather-bound volume containing letters from patrons whose research she had supported, whose questions she had answered, whose scholarly projects she had helped bring to completion. Among those letters was one from the FBI, a carefully worded note that thanked her for her service to the nation and acknowledged her role in protecting American security during a dangerous period of history. She kept that letter in her desk drawer at home, rarely looking at it, but knowing it was there, a reminder of the strange intersection between her ordinary professional life and the hidden world of espionage and counterintelligence. She had not sought that intersection, had never imagined that her meticulous record-keeping and attention to detail would contribute to unraveling a Soviet intelligence operation. But when the moment came, when she recognized that something was wrong with Dr. Michael Preston's borrowing pattern, she had trusted her instincts and acted on them, despite uncertainty and potential skepticism. The lesson she took from the experience, and the lesson she tried to convey in her occasional lectures and conversations about the case, was that vigilance came in many forms. It did not require dramatic gestures or heroic sacrifices. Sometimes it simply required doing one's job with professional competence, maintaining detailed records, paying attention to patterns, and being willing to speak up when something seemed wrong. In an age of sophisticated technology and elaborate intelligence operations, the most significant breakthroughs sometimes came from the most unlikely sources. A librarian who noticed that 17 books formed a pattern, who understood that the pattern represented something more troubling than scholarly curiosity, and who had the courage to report what she had seen. Catherine Walsh died in 2008 at the age of 70, surrounded by books in the small house in Cambridge where she had lived for most of her adult life. Her obituary in the Boston Globe mentioned her decades of service at the library, her dedication to helping researchers, and her role in what the newspaper called a significant counterintelligence case during the Cold War era. But the full details of her contribution remained classified in FBI files, known only to the few people who understood how a simple stack of library checkout cards had exposed a Soviet spy and demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful weapon in intelligence work was not technology or tradecraft, but rather one person's trained ability to notice when something was not quite right. The 17 books that Yuri Volkov borrowed from the Boston Public Library were never returned. They became evidence in his trial, physical artifacts of systematic intelligence gathering that had operated beneath the surface of ordinary life. Those books, with their checkout cards bearing the false name Michael Preston and the dates of borrowing that Catherine had studied so carefully, eventually found their way into the FBI's training materials, teaching examples of how intelligence operations left traces for those who knew how to look for them. And somewhere in the classified files of American counterintelligence operations sits a report detailing how a head librarian's observation of unusual borrowing patterns led to the identification and arrest of a Soviet illegal who had operated undetected for years. That report acknowledges what Catherine Walsh always understood, that libraries were not neutral spaces immune to the conflicts of their era, but rather institutions embedded in the world with all its complexities and dangers, and that the people who managed those institutions had responsibilities that extended beyond simply stamping due dates and shelving books. They were guardians of knowledge systems that could be exploited or protected, and sometimes protecting them required nothing more than paying attention, trusting professional instincts, and having the courage to act on what one observed. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories, and check out the video on screen. I'm sure you'll enjoy it. See you next time.